Okay, let's unpack this. When you picture the wealthiest nations on Earth, what immediately springs to mind? Maybe towering skylines like New York, or perhaps the big financial centers, London maybe, the industrial powerhouses. Well, get ready for a bit of a surprise, because our deep dive today into the very latest data on the world's richest countries reveals a really fascinating paradox.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because that conventional image, it often doesn't quite align with the complex reality of how wealth is actually measured and how it's distributed. Our main source today, I Paesi più ricchi del mondo nel 2025, just published a few days back, September 6th, from Matellarari.com. It really challenges our assumptions. It helps us understand not just who is rich, but critically how that wealth is defined and, some uncomfortable truths about how it's spread around.
Exactly. That focus on the how is so important. So our mission for you today is exactly that. Cut through the numbers, understand the, often surprising economic models of these top countries, and then confront a really critical question. What does rich truly mean when you look beyond the dazzling stats? Especially, in a world grappling with growing inequalities. So here's where it gets really interesting, because the article kicks off by telling us that many of the richest countries are actually among the smallest. Like, think micronations. Luxembourg, San Marino, Malta, Singapore. How do these smaller players dominate? It's clearly not about size.
That does raise the question, doesn't it? What's their secret? What are they doing differently? Well, our source points to a few things. Sophisticated financial sectors, for one, really attractive tax regimes, and an extraordinary capacity, really, to attract capital and talent from all over the globe. Think Luxembourg, it's huge for investment funds. Then you've got others, like Qatar, Brunei, the UAE. Their wealth comes mainly from huge hydrocarbon reserves, massive oil and gas revenues, and places like Macau. Luxury tourism and casinos are the main drivers there, even after, the pandemic challenges. So very specialized models.
Right, so they've really leveraged specific advantages, haven't they? Finance, resources,
Right.
on a global scale. So if these unique models are generating such huge wealth figures, what does this mean for how we actually measure prosperity? Because just looking at gross domestic product, GDP, that seems like it only tells part of the story, kind of like just reading the cover of the book.
Precisely. Yeah, economists generally agree. Just looking at raw GDP, the total value produced, it can be pretty misleading when comparing countries. That's why they prefer GDP per capita. But even more importantly, adjusted for purchasing power parity, PPP. Think about it like comparing a salary in London versus one in a small town. Same money buys very different amounts of stuff, right? PPP adjusts for local prices, for inflation. So you're comparing apples to apples. It gives a much more realistic view of what citizens can actually buy, their actual economic power.
Okay. That makes a lot more sense for comparison, a much better baseline.
Yeah.
But even with PPP, the article quickly adds a big caveat, doesn't it? A high per capita income doesn't automatically mean everyone's doing well. It sounds like deep inequalities can exist even in these supposedly super rich places. The average can hide a lot.
Indeed. And the source highlights how the COVID-19 pandemic really starkly exposed these contradictions. Rich countries had resources, yes, but not everyone benefited equally. Not by a long shot. Remote workers often did okay, maybe even saved money. But less skilled workers, people in lockdown sectors, much more vulnerable, job losses, reduced hours. And since then, news shocks, the war in Ukraine, energy crises, food crises, the conflict between Israel and Hamas, they've just made inequalities worse. Inflation especially has hit low-income families really hard. They spend most of their money on basics, food, housing, transport. Their purchasing power is just eroded.
Yeah, it really drives home that the cost of living crisis isn't just a statistic. It's real families struggling, even in wealthy nations. And zooming out globally, the numbers for the rich-poor divide, they're pretty staggering, aren't they?
They are. Stark. According to the IMF, the gap is immense. In the 10 poorest countries, the average per capita income, PPP adjusted, is just $1,600. $1,600. Compare that to the 10 richest. It's over $118,000. That's not just a gap, it's a chasm. And the source suggests it actually risks getting wider. It's a huge global challenge.
And speaking of numbers that might be skewed, we have to talk about tax havens, right? It seems like some of the wealth boosting these top countries' stats isn't really generated by their own citizens' activity, is it?
That's a really critical point. Yeah, many nations right at the top are effectively tax havens. They offer super low, sometimes zero corporate taxes. So multinationals find it very attractive to legally book their profits there, even if the actual business, the jobs, the factories are somewhere else entirely. So this huge wealth gets recorded there, boosting their GDP per capita. But it doesn't always mean much for the average person living there. Not necessarily more jobs or better services across the board. It's such a big issue that over 130 countries signed up in 2021 for a global minimum tax 15% on multinational corporate profits. But as the source notes, this measure still faces a lot of political resistance, concerns about sovereignty, capital flight, lobbying. So it highlights how tough it is to get global agreement on tackling this. It might just stay on paper for a while, unfortunately.
Right, so it really complicates how we think about national wealth. It's not just money in, but does it actually benefit the people there? Okay, so with all these nuances, PPP, inequality, tax havens, let's look at the actual top 10 for 2025. This is from the IMF's World Economic Outlook, April 2025. This list really brings home the diversity we've been talking about.
It does. Okay, the top 10, according to the IMF, are number 1, Singapore, at $156,755 per capita PPP. Then Luxembourg, very close, $152,950. After that, Macau at $134,041. Then Ireland, $133,999. Then we have Qatar at $121,605. Norway, $107,891. Switzerland, $97,598. And rounding up the list, Brunei, $95,758. Oil monarchies like Qatar, Brunei, advanced European economies, Ireland, Norway, Switzerland. And then there's Guyana, a real newcomer. Its rapid rise is almost entirely down to discovering huge oil deposits recently. It just shows how quickly resource finds can reshape a country's economic stats almost overnight.
Guyana really stands out there. A clear example of resource wealth changing the picture dramatically. But looking at this whole list and considering everything we've discussed, measurement, inequality, global finance, what's the big takeaway for you? It's clearly much more complex than just a single number, isn't it?
The clearest takeaway, I think, is that global wealth is incredibly concentrated and often not very equitably distributed. That's the core issue. While some citizens in these top nations enjoy, extremely high living standards, many others, even within those same rich countries, are struggling. So the real challenge isn't just growing the pie, pushing up GDP. It's about reducing those social fractures, those deep divides that persist despite the shiny statistics. It's ensuring prosperity actually means widespread well-being for everyone, not just a select few.
Yeah, this deep dive really shows rich isn't a simple label at all. Prosperity often has this complex backstory how the wealth is made and, crucially, how it's shared. It's not just about the big numbers, is it? It's about the systems and the people behind them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which leads to a question for you, our listener. Given these stark realities, the concentrated wealth, the inequalities, the struggles with global solutions like the minimum tax, what do you think is the single most impactful step? Something nations or international bodies could realistically do to start reducing these social fractures, both within rich countries and globally?
Something to really mull over, isn't it? Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the paradox of prosperity and inequality.